Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, who is the CEO and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss the outcome of two key summits this week, and consider whether what was discussed and agreed amounted to a major leap forward for the EU, or more a case of more of the same and business as usual. As always, totally interactive session. I have some questions for Fabian and Janis. If you have any questions, please either write them in the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, or you can click on the raised hands button and I will come to you a little later on. My only request, as always, is that you are as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. Let us jump straight in because we have a lot of ground to cover, covering two summits rather than our normal one. Janis, let me come to you first. I mean, we had the NATO summit first, and then the European Council, the EU summit that finished remarkably early, actually, at 11 o'clock last night. How important was this as a moment? And in broad terms, do you see this, given what was on the agenda, what they were talking about, as another Zeitenwende, if you like, another watershed moment? Or is it maybe perhaps were we overplaying their significance in the run-up? How do you read it?
Well, first of all, I would also add the G7 summit. So we had actually three summits within 10 days. Actually, I think the most important one was the NATO summit, because also the fear of something going wrong there. So it was less, what at the end will be the result, because that was already predetermined, because there was an agreement, especially when it comes to the new spending target, when it comes to defense spending. But there was a fear that something could go wrong, both with respect to that agreement which had been found, but also with respect to potentially Donald Trump saying something with respect to Article 5, which might undermine NATO. So that was probably the most important one of the summits. The EU summit, I think, was not seen as being a key determinant in terms of what will happen, what will be decided, and we will come to that in detail, because actually not that much was decided at the summit. So I wouldn't say that this was something which is a Zeitenwende. I think if something would have gone wrong, especially in the context of the NATO summit, that would have sent a very negative signal. But in terms of what actually was decided, I would not argue that this is such a watershed moment as some of the moments which we witnessed over the past years, where actually I think the word watershed, Zeitenwende, really apply. In this case, I would not really.
And I want to come back on that 5% of GDP defense spending by 2035 and how significant it was in a moment. But Fabian, your broad assessment of where we are and how important, and Janis was right to correct me, these three key meetings have been.
Well, I think while I fully agree with Janis, when we look at the results, it is not in any way an unexpected outcome. Certainly for the NATO summit, we knew what was happening, with, of course, the spectacle of Europe kowtowing to Trump very much in the foreground. And I think in that sense, maybe it is a Zeitenwende, as we're seeing what this is going to look like for the coming months and years. Maybe this is now the rule we have to get used to for Europe, that in the end we are simply appeasing, fulfilling whatever is coming out of the White House.
Can I just follow up on that? Because Almut Muller, a director at the EPC, wrote a to-the-point commentary last week, and she said, and I'm quoting, "As long as Europe is vulnerable without the US, the Europeans need to do their best to keep Washington in and hope for the US to play a helpful role in Europe's long overdue trajectory towards taking responsibility for its own security." I mention that because if it was a summit where fundamentally, and critics say, look, apart from the 5%, which I'll come back to the detail in a minute, this was fundamentally a Trump appeasement summit. This is, as Janis put it, You didn't want it to go wrong. Was that inevitable? And therefore, the correct approach, I mean, some have, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte raised quite a lot of eyebrows with the tone of how he referred to Donald Trump and the degree of kowtowing. Is that just what we have to do, even if it's an interim, because Europe simply isn't ready to replace America, Fabian? Or was there another route they could have taken? What do you think?
Well, I think certainly we can question the style in which this was done, whether that was really necessary. You mentioned the language, the whole imagery of the summit. I think you can question. I would also question whether we approached it in the right tactical frame. I would actually say that going into a summit where you've already given everything away is not the best negotiation tactic. However, we were lucky insofar that Trump didn't follow it up with more demands or different difficult demands. But yes, it is true that, of course, there are two underlying truths here. One is that we have to increase our defense capabilities, our readiness. But here, and we'll come back to the 3.55%, is this the right way of thinking about that? Because in the end, it should be about capability and not about some arbitrary numbers we're pulling out. And the second reality is that we have a great dependence on the US. But for example, one issue, which I'm sure we'll come back to, which wasn't actually mentioned very much, is not what we are going to do for our defense industry, but what are we going to do for Ukraine? How are we going to ensure that the most important forward defense we have at the moment is going to be maintained, which I think is a huge question we haven't really addressed at any of the summits.
And Janis, to that point about substance and style, so if I understand Fabian correctly, really substantively, that is what the EU had to do, that kowtowing, if you have whatever phrase you use, appeasing Trump, flattery, huge dollop of flattery thrown in. But does the style matter? And could it be that the EU, by EU member states, those members of NATO from Europe, by talking in that language, have sent Trump a signal that will encourage him simply to keep asking for more?
Well, first of all, because you were referring to Almut's piece and the arguments which you raised, let's be frank and honest about it. It is the way in which we have behaved, the way in which we react, how we express ourselves individually and collectively as Europeans is determined by the fact that we're so weak. It is our own weakness, which at the end of the day forces us not only sometimes to succumb to what he's asking us to do, but also forcing us to react or to deal with him the way we have been dealing in The Hague. But let's not omit the point that you can do this once. Maybe you could do it twice, but at some point it will no longer work. So even, this approach of trying to appease him in the way which we have done, including also, and this is where we are and but the point we have now reached, allowing him to sleep in the castle, to feel like being a king. And that's the level at which we have reached in terms of how we now deal with international politics at the highest level. But all the source of that, at the end of the day, is our own weakness. And by the way, if you now see this from an external perspective, from a non-European perspective, we're not sending a sign of leadership. So we're often asking that we want to be taken serious at the international level. We want to play a leadership role. We want to make sure that we have influence, that we can defend our interests, our values, and so forth. But if you see the spectacle from the outside, it is very much a sign of weakness. By the way, you could also take into account of the reaction of Europeans when it comes to what happened in Iran and the attacks of the US and the breach of international law, the fact that we actually are not even individually or collectively are mentioning, we actually are calling for international law to be obeyed to. But I think there is a congruence among lawyers
come back to that. Come back to that in a moment.
So I'm just, yeah, but I'm just saying it is
Yeah.
important how this is viewed from the outside.
Exactly.
It's not only how it's viewed from the inside and how it's viewed in Washington, it's also important how it's viewed from the outside.
Just coming back on this issue of the 5%, and as Fabian touched on earlier, Janis, and let me come to you first on this, 3.5% on what you might call pure defence, plus 1.5% on critical infrastructure. So is this just clever accounting of the type the EU is quite often famous for, that nobody will get anywhere near 5%, but by doing it this way, you can make it look as if they are? How serious a commitment is the 5%, do you believe?
But first of all, I think that chances are higher that member states will get close to the 1.5. Because it is formulated in a way that one can easily do creative accounting in terms of what actually accounts for expenditure, which supports the defense and security. But when it comes to 3.5, I think one needs to be realistic, because if you look into what that actually means, I have my doubts that a good number of countries, NATO countries, will be actually able and politically ready to reach these levels. But then Fabian was right. At the end of the day, 3.5 is just a number. And if you look at it from the perspective of EU member states, if we would be cooperating with each other, if we would be investing the euros we're investing into defense more smartly, and this is nothing new, this is something we've been discussing for decades, we could spend much less than the 3.5 and get more efficient results from every euro or dollar we spend. So actually, there's more that needs to be taken into account. And the other thing I'm asking myself is persistence. Even if we would now move in the right direction, increase expenditure, will we do that for a longer period of time? If the reason why we're doing this, and it's not only obviously Trump why we're doing it, it's also the situation, especially in Europe, regarding the situation with Russia. If the situation changes over the upcoming years, and it seems as if we have an improvement of the situation, I'm not speculating, how will member states, NATO member states also, react to that? Will they then actually be ready to spend not more, but will they be able to?
And indeed, it will become politically more difficult if the immediate sense of threat goes. But Fabian, on that point, both about the 5% itself and how realistic that is and how genuine this commitment is, but also, as I understand it, and the EPC has been doing some analysis on this, the idea is that NATO members will have to submit annual plans on how they are moving towards the 5% goal, but the pledge and the degree to which they're living up to the pledge will only be formally reviewed in 2029, which happens to be the year that, and I hesitate to say this, but I feel I have to, in theory at least, Donald Trump leaves the White House. So does the timing of that review, as well as perhaps some of the clever accounting, what should we read into that, Fabian? Does that increase one's level of cynicism about how real this commitment is?
I'm not quite sure whether you can increase the level of cynicism, given that it's already quite high. I think we already know, I mean, for example, one thing we haven't mentioned is that one country already has said it's not going to do it. There are a number of other countries which I think have rather blatantly agreed to it because they were under pressure, but have no intention of moving in that direction. But even for those who have agreed to it genuinely, the pressures are enormous. They are already enormous. Just to give you one example, we just had the scenario in the UK where a spending cut to social expenditure had to be reversed because the backbenchers in the Labour Party would not accept it. This is the reality of what this would actually mean if we go to these kind of numbers. It means more taxation, or it means cutting elsewhere, or both, and it means more borrowing. So this is very, very difficult to reach. And I think the hope is that we will move in the right direction, that over time the Trump problem is going to go away. But I think what is the real fear in the end is what Janis was mentioning, that at some point in time it will become easier not to do it because the immediate pressure is not there anymore.
But nevertheless, we have seen a very strong, whether the number is reachable, whether the number is remotely realistic, or there is, going back to my question about watershed moment, it does feel as if the world has woken up to the reality that we will all inevitably need to spend more on defense, that it isn't, that Donald Trump had a point when he said Europe is not taking responsibility for its own defense. So it is a significant moment, or not. I mean, it's not just window dressing, is it?
Yeah, I mean, just to emphasize that this is not something Donald Trump has come up with. It has been a very long-standing complaint from the US that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense. And there are many people also on this side of the Atlantic who have agreed to this for quite a long time. So in that sense, yes, we are moving towards something which does take more into account what we have to do, given the very real threat of Russia, which we know is on our borders. The difficulty is that we are still not approaching this in a very strategic or rational way. If we were to sit down and think about what is it we need in terms of capabilities, and what is the best way of getting there, then it wouldn't be by setting a top-down target, which is patently unrealistic. We don't have the industry to deliver this amount of increase. We don't have the people to man all of these defenses. So we should be in a much more planning mode, strategic mode. And that would also mean that we are finally addressing the issue that in the end, we are spending a lot on defense. If you look at absolute numbers, what we're spending in Europe is significantly more, for example, than Russia is, but we are doing it very ineffectively.
Indeed, and that links very much to the conversation that then came at the EU summit, which when Antonio Costa said afterwards yesterday, he said the NATO summit, EU member states decided to spend more. Today we worked on how to spend better. I want to come back on that in a moment, but just sticking with the NATO summit for a minute, Janis, and coming back to when you said this summit was driven by the fear of something going wrong, and you mentioned Article 5 and the concern that we might see Donald Trump backtrack in a very serious way from Article 5. Now, he appeared to be doing so just before the summit when he was asked how strong his commitment was, are you still committed? Do you stand by it? And he said, it depends on your definition. But then he appeared later to give a more concrete reassurance, saying, yes, I stand by this. How do you read this? And have we simply averted, to use your earlier phrase, something going wrong now, but it's still there? Or do you think Trump has, because of the flattery, because of the commitment everyone gave, because of the sense he feels he's won at this summit, that he is now committed to it?
Well, it's part of how Trump acts, by the way, also at the national level in the US itself, but especially at the global level, that he moves and he is not clear in how he expresses himself, and you always need to interpret. And by the way, when he does that, he also creates attention for himself, which at the end of the day is which he's very much seeking. So the unpredictability, the vagueness, in the plane towards Europe saying something while being in The Hague, saying something a bit different. The communique has a strong language, but what at the end is the result is that there are question marks. that you cannot be sure as to whether he would, in the case where something is required, you can be assured that he would take the right decision. And that is something which, when it comes to deterrence, when it comes to things which are like Article 5, put down on paper, it requires a strong belief that you would actually push it through if you get to a situation where there's need to do so. And with Trump, and that will be until he will leave the White House, and we do not know what happens thereafter and who will succeed him. And maybe he thinks that he could stay longer than what many think. What will happen thereafter? And even if there is, and I think that's where we are still naive. We have this feeling that, well, at some point he will maybe not be as strong in the US, and then someone else will enter the White House and there will be more clarity. This feels as if what will happen will then be status quo ante. We move back to where we have been. But the unpredictability is structural. So even if someone else is in the office, you ask yourself, yeah, but what happens when the next person will enter the White House? So that is something where structurally, I think we have been moving in the wrong direction because there have been so many question marks. And by the way, this is the way we think about that. Donald Trump doesn't think about it. He thinks about today and tomorrow.
Fabian, for the EU, it really is a question on an ongoing basis. That fear of something going wrong, the strategy is always about how to stop it going wrong and how to contain it. And we'll come back to that later in the context of the trade discussions, the discussions on the trade negotiations with the US, and how do you play that? I want to come on to the EU summit in a moment. But just in terms of how this debate moves forward, and the debate really about the future of NATO, do you feel that for the moment, at least NATO is safe and is sort of holding firm, if you like, or do you still have real concerns for its future?
I think we all should have real concerns because the unpredictability is one aspect. Certainly, Trump might decide tomorrow that he would put the common defense pledge under threat or whatever else it might be. We also still have a number of things to come. For example, we have no idea what he is going to do with regard to US troops in Europe. How quickly, how chaotically, what kind of signals will be going to the rest of the world and to Europe's enemies, including Russia. And I think this is also a big question, which is in the background somewhere, in how far is there the possibility of an accommodation between Putin and Trump, and what does that mean for the rest of the world? And I would very much also emphasize that for me, the big unanswered question is Ukraine. Because ultimately, all of these long-term plans, because we're talking about defense and security very much in the long term, can easily be undone by what happens in the short term. And the short term is our forward defense in Ukraine.
Indeed. Let us come back on that. Yeah, sorry, Janis.
Just one point. I think in the debates, also partially now in how we have been debating it, but also in the wider public debate, there is always this question, what does the future of NATO look like? And it depends on the US, it depends on Donald Trump, it depends on XY, which is across the Atlantic. Whereas I think not only the future of the EU, which the EU member states determined by themselves in many ways, but also the future of NATO is being determined by the readiness of Europeans to live up to what they have to do. If actually we as Europeans, together with other non-European allies within NATO, are ready to assume more responsibility, not only understand that we have to do it, but implement it, and then also stick to what we have agreed that we would do, so it has endurance. That is, I think, the best guarantee for the future of NATO. So the variable, yes, often we look into the US and into what Trump is thinking and might be doing in the upcoming days, weeks, months, years. But actually, I think the key variable is how much are we ready to deliver? And that is then determining the future of NATO, because it also enhances our ability to make sure that Trump and the Trumps of this world.
So let us focus on that, because that brings us to the EU summit, which discussed a number of issues. One of the key issues it discussed was indeed in relation to defence and security, and the reaction to that pledge given at the NATO summit. And I mentioned that quote earlier from Antonio Costa saying, at the NATO summit, we promised to spend more. Today, we focused on spending better. But he had also said in his invitation letter to EU leaders, he said that there had been progress, that the discussions on defence and security were bearing fruit. But he also said we must stay the course and accelerate progress towards Europe's common defence readiness by 2030. Janis, did they stay the course and accelerate progress? Did they indicate from those conversations how they would put their money where their mouth is, if you like, in meeting that 5% pledge? And did they give any indication of what this might mean? You talked about, Fabian referred to the UK budget, and did it give any indication of the implications of all of this for the EU budget? How concrete was the conversation about defence and security last night?
So did they stay on course? Yes. Did they accelerate in terms of the process? No. And as we have been discussing also in the past, from our perspective, from my perspective, what we have seen since 2022 is moving in a certain direction. But in terms of the speed and the amount of what needs to be done in terms of the new reality we live in, we're not living up to the needs. And I think that this summit, like previous summits, unfortunately, has not made a major qualitative leap. One, because we have still differences among member states of how to treat with the situation. By the way, also how to deal with Trump and the US itself, with our major differences among member states. That we still have the mindset of thinking in very national terms when it comes to European cooperation. And if you look into what has been, what was decided or not decided at this European Council, we see that, I'm quoting from the Council conclusion, the European Council conclusion, progress will be reviewed at the October European Council. The Commission has been asked, and the Commission and the HRVP have been asked to present a roadmap for implementing the defense readiness objectives. So we're again pushing the debates to the next European Council meeting, asking the Commission to come up with proposals. And let's also have in mind, in between, the Commission will come forward with its proposal regarding the MFF. On the 16th of July, they will present the first set of Commission proposals. And we will see that there will be, probably a transfer of means, and that's also what a good number of member states are asking, towards defense, or in the direction of defense, or linked to defense. But in terms of the readiness to do the things which have the gravity of moving things really at a different speed, I don't expect that will happen with these proposals or until October. So yes, there is a lot of reiteration. We will do this, we will do that. But in the end of the day, the pace of what we need to do, because you were asking, did we accelerate? We haven't accelerating, and we also this time we have not accelerated.
But Fabian, the focus of the discussion appeared to be in the sort of direction you were calling for when you said, if we invest more smartly, it's not so much about the amount, but the how. Antonio Costa was talking about investing together more rationally, more efficiently, as a team, using aggregation of demand, joint procurement, standardization, simplification. So the right words were all there. When you look at those council conclusions, do you feel that we are decisively moving towards that approach, really, of look at the capabilities you need, look at how you're going to get them, and do this collaboratively? Do you feel that is finally, issues like pooling of defense capabilities have been discussed in the EU for many, many years. Are we finally moving in the right direction, do you think, Fabian?
Well, I think it shows that we're very good at producing words. And as you point out, it's very often the same words, and they are the right words. And it would be great if we actually did what we said in these conclusions. But the reality is that we've been here before many, 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 many times. And we have said all of the right things. But when it then comes to actually putting real money behind some of this, moving forward, not saying we reiterate that we should be doing this, and we have been reiterating for a number of years that we should be doing this, but actually saying we are going to do it now, that seems to be missing in the end. And when we're talking, on the one hand, and yes, we have had some doubts about the 5% target, the 3% target, but just to recall what kind of amounts of money we're talking about here. And then we're talking about instruments at the European level which have 1.5 billion in it. It's completely at a different scale, and it's not going to move the needle. This is, in the end, the common complaint we have had for a number of years now. This is back to the progress illusion. What we're doing is nowhere near the scale and the scope of the challenge, and we are moving nowhere near fast enough if we really want to get to this point.
Janis.
I think if people would or are listening to us, there will be people who will be countering, yes, but is this not how the EU works? We make very slow progress, one step after the other. There are pressure which are increasing, and once the pressure is there, we will do what is necessary to do. I understand where this logic comes from, and there are also, examples of the past which indicate in this direction. But I think the gravity of the challenge we're having in front of us, we're talking about war and peace. This is not, something which it's at the core of national sovereignty, and it's also at the core of our future, and also future generations, by the way, also of our kids. So it's the gravity of what we have to do, and the amount of things we have to do at a certain speed. It's not that we have the time to say, I remember during the Euro crisis, 9, 10, we had to wait until 12 or 14, 15 in order to get out of the situation. This was luxury compared to what we have now. We are under time pressure. So Costa is right, and others who say we need to be ready by 30. This is 5 years. In defense terms, this is tomorrow. But if you dig a bit deeper and you look into the debate and you look into how people are motivated to do certain things at the national level, they're still very much determined by national defense and national economic interest. They think of this through the prism of, how is this affecting us? How is it affecting our security situation, our individual security situation? How is it affecting our economic interest, our industries? And that's the logic through which they still look at these things. And I think, and I would add to that, and that is making me even more worried, that there's a lack of trust in each other. Because if you want to actually make that step move, adopt a different mindset when it comes to cooperation and defense, you need to trust in the other that they will deliver, that you can trust in them when you get into a difficult situation. So if you also want to use it, we will specialize. Can you then trust that others will do what they need to do in a system which is depending on certain specializations? And what adds to that is that we also have political question marks. There are people who ask themselves, what happens? May I just add, Jacki, what happens in 27 in France? What happens if you have someone else coming to power? What happens if in key member states the political developments are negative? Can you trust then the other one? These are things which go very deep, and that obstructs us from doing what we actually need to do under time pressure.
But
and that's structural. That's structural.
But going back to the point about investing more smartly, and there's no need to duplicate, and as you say, countries can specialize. We need to see what capabilities we're missing, where we're missing them, and who needs to do what. There is an argument, a very strong argument, as we see a fierce battle ahead over the EU budget. This is a way to save money. We can get where we need to go, and we don't need to, if we're smart about it, we don't need to find the huge sums that will be required if we're not smart about it. Why isn't that? Money tends to drive, EU leaders tend to understand that sort of argument when it comes to pressure on their budgets. So why isn't that working?
Because I think deep down, you still don't have that mindset, although it seems to be so logical. And by the way, we've seen this over the last 10, 15 years, that often we have been saying, well, it just doesn't make sense not to do certain things.
Yeah.
But there are reasons why we're not doing them. That's why I was referring to these deep-rooted reasons why we're not doing certain things. So you're right. The logic tells us, let's spend smarter, then we can spend less. We get more out of each dollar or euro we're spending. I say dollar because we spend often in buying US defense products. So we spend that money in a way which is smart. But actually, this is not the argument which is flying. There are other things which are prohibiting. Now, are things moving in a better direction? Yes, I'm not doubting that, but not at the speed and at the amount of what we need. And by the way, if you think of the MFF, this is peanuts. Huh? This is
Fabian, you wanted to jump in. Short one, and then I'd like to come on to Ukraine.
I'll try to be short, but it's a rather philosophical point. Because I think what is behind this is in the end that we are looking at a very different phase in European integration. Because what we are facing now is not integrating and then we have a common benefit which can be distributed. We are facing a situation where we have to distribute costs between the members of the European Union. And yes, there is an argument that the total costs can be reduced if you're doing it together, but it is still politically much, much harder to distribute costs. And what we are seeing, and I think we're seeing it in all policy areas, not just in defense and security, is what you're getting is an incredibly strong incentive to free ride or even to be parasitic, to just benefit from what others are doing with no intention of doing it yourself. And if that becomes a common behavior, the whole system doesn't work anymore. So we actually have to ask ourselves whether the structures we have, whether the European Union, the way it is designed now, can deliver on these kind of promises because of these deep structural problems.
Okay, let's take some specific issues in turn. On Ukraine, key issue on the table was the renewal of the existing package of sanctions, but also the proposal for the 18th package of sanctions. Janis, in terms of what they focused on and where we are on the 18th package, it wasn't agreed. Will it be agreed?
First of all, let me just remind everyone, because it's becoming a habit. It's the third time that it happened, that the document that was agreed to was agreed to by the EU26.
Indeed.
So it misses the support of one member state, again, Hungary, or Orban, of the Orban government. But now you were talking about the 18th sanction package.
Yeah.
I think that my expectation is that we've seen this happening in the past, that there are national concerns and interests which member states have in their mind. There's always one or the other. In this case, Slovakia, who's beyond Orban, is playing difficult. But it's not only one or the other member states. It is the need to find a compromise which all member states are happy with. But if you look into path dependency, if you look into the pressures under which the EU is operating, the situation in Ukraine, the difficult continuous situation with Russia, my expectation would be is that there will be an 18th package. Question is, what does it include? How far does it go? And how quickly will we require a 19th package? So the fact that they are not able to agree onto it now, I think is something which we've seen in the past, where there were question marks, and at the end of the day, they were able to agree, and then we were at the moment where we agreed already thinking about the next package. And
Indeed.
I think that that's something that we will experience again this time.
And Fabian, Janis referred there to the fact that yet again, conclusions at 26, a statement at 26, not European Council conclusions because of Hungary. As we look at the whole issue of Ukraine's big bid for EU membership, what is the state of play, do you think, in the discussions behind the scenes about what can be done, if anything, to prevent Hungary in particular from blocking any progress in those negotiations? Are there workarounds that are being looked at? Can there be a workaround to prevent this? And if not, where does this leave the EU?
My starting point would be that it's the wrong question, because that would assume that the only bloc we have is Hungary. the reality is rather more complex than that. I think, firstly, there are a number of countries which might not say this publicly, but in private are rather pleased that Hungary is taking all of the criticism, whereas they can just simply pretend that they are in favor without having to come good on that promise. That's one problem. The second problem is, and as the work of Janis and others has highlighted in the test of times, is that we also have the big question of all of the reforms, which we are going to have to start progressing within the European Union, for which I find probably 26 out of 27 are not willing to do what is necessary. Maybe it's 27 out of 27. So I think this is part of the equation, which wasn't really addressed at all. Then we have the question of what does that mean for the other candidate countries? Because we shouldn't just talk about Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine is an imperative, also because of the security situation. But we should also be talking about Moldova, about Georgia, and about the Western Balkans, where when you look at the conclusions on the Western Balkans, they are rather meager, and that is overstating what is in the conclusions. So I think what we are actually facing is, again, coming back to the argument I just made, it's a deep-seated structural problem. It is not an individual country problem. It is the problem that the Union is not able and willing to move ahead with accession of Ukraine and others in a quick and timely fashion. Yes, there are workarounds. They are not as good as full membership, but there are ways we can address that, both for Ukraine, but also for policy
But
areas.
as you say, the wrong question, really. And Janis, we have discussed in a related series, the democracy reform conversations, the work that you and colleagues have been doing on what is needed in terms of internal EU reform for enlargement, but what is needed more generally, the reform imperative in and of itself, but also the reform imperative. I see nothing in the conclusions this time about what was supposed to be a parallel process. All the time we're supposed to be talking about what the countries are doing to prepare and what the EU is doing to prepare. Should we read anything into the lack of words there? Is it simply that this wasn't the moment, or has the whole debate about the internal EU reform gone off the boil and been pushed into the background?
I think that both, when it comes to the enlargement imperative and when it comes to reform imperative, we're not moving in the right direction. And one is linked to the other. When it comes to enlargement, I think that we are actually moving in the wrong direction. And it's not a coincidence that Zelensky was saying that delays with respect to accession, obviously he was talking about Ukraine's accession, but I would also say delays when it comes to when it comes to enlargement in general, is eroding trust in the EU. That was a warning he was giving. And he was giving this warning because actually you can sense that there is a less of a readiness to move in the direction of enlargement, which, by the way, then also even further undermines the need for the EU to reform itself. And the EU needs to reform or modernize its operating system, because I know that, talking about reform implies governance reforms and convention, but this is not the entire story. So both with respect to enlargement and with respect to internal reform, I think we're not moving in the right direction. And if you want to see how the discrepancy is between, the Sunday speeches, declarations, even promises when it comes to enlargement and Monday's reality, just look to the following. The Commission did not publish its in-depth pre-enlargement reviews, which the European Council had called for, which Ursula von der Leyen had promised when she started her new mandate within 100 days. The Commission did not deliver. The Council did not present a follow-up report on the future of EU enlargement and internal reform, which it should have presented. And the European Council, so what we're talking about, what happened yesterday, did not present a roadmap for the future work on internal reform, which it itself had promised 1 year ago in June of 24. This shows the discrepancy between what actually we were doing, we're calling for, and what we're actually seeing happening on the ground. So to put it simply, and to link it to our publication, I think that the member states, the EU, is not responding to the test of times. And that, I think, is indicative not only with respect to the question of how we move on with respect to enlargement and reform, it's also indicative of the level of ambition of the EU in general. That is what makes me skeptical. It's not only about enlargement and reform, it's something which goes further. And it hollows out the EU, it hollows out the EU from within.
Okay, and I want to come back to sort of where we are and how you see it in broad terms at the end of our conversation, but two more issues to cover specifically from the summit. I want to come to the economic agenda later on, and I mentioned the trade talks with the US earlier, but in terms of, first of all, the Middle East and the discussions there, Janis, when you look at the conclusions here, do you get a sense that EU leaders really are relatively united behind a common position on the situation in Gaza, on the escalating military conflict between Israel and Iran? I think Fabian mentioned earlier, yes, keep underlining the importance of the respect for international law, for the UN Charter. Is your sense that the EU, I mean, Costa talks about the EU having a role. He says in the end, all of this will only be solved through effective diplomacy, and here the EU has a role. Is your sense that the EU27 are coming together on the Middle East, or that these words are hiding some deep divisions?
Well, I would, first of all, have severe doubts as to whether the EU or even key members of the EU are playing a strong role when it comes to diplomacy. If you look into the E3 meeting with Iran and how Trump responded to it, in the sense of, I don't care what they talk about, because actually the people in Iran, those in power, only want to talk to us. This is what he was saying. So bluntly, he was saying, ignore what they're doing. It's about me and about my role in what is happening. Now, when it comes to, and these things are linked with each other, we all know Gaza and Iran, at least we can define a common position. Are we on the same page? No, we're not. If you look into Gaza and the relationship with Israel, the Council conclusion take note of a report on Israel's compliance with Article 2 of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. So at least we take note of that. But there are some member states who say, well, not only should we take note, we need to go further. We need to put pressure on Israel if we want to be taken serious, and also if we want to take into account what the Israeli government is doing.
To the report, the internal EU
yes,
report,
exactly,
that found that the Israel was in breach of some of its human rights obligations under the association agreement, which has led some member states to even suggest that agreement should be suspended. But there seems to be a huge amount of division over.
Oh, yes. But then this is not new, okay? If it comes to Israel, when it comes to the Middle East, since the 1970s, since the beginning of European political cooperation, for those who remember, this has always been one of the most thorniest issues among member states, and difficult for member states to find a joint position for different reasons, including historical reasons. So they struggle, and they continue to struggle. But then it's not only Gaza, but it's also Iran. And here, what the European Council says, it welcomes the cessation of hostilities. It calls on all parties to abide by international law. Just let me take up this point. You know, when the attacks happen, and one can argue as to whether, I mean, the US attack happened and whether it actually has delivered, and there's still the verdict, which is still out. What there's an agreement on is that from an international law perspective, this was breaching international law.
And no one wants to say it.
Nobody.
Because they don't want to upset Trump.
Obviously. And when they indicate it towards their own publics, they immediately, the day after, or maybe on the same day, say things like, well, someone needs to do the dirty job. And the Americans, at least, might help to make sure that Iran will never be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, which the EU27 agreed to. And we will not criticize Trump, not because of Iran or of Israel, but we're not criticizing him because we fear that then we have to pay a price in terms of NATO or in terms of the tariffs. So there are the cross linkages, and let's not be naive. Trump and his administration know that.
I want to come to the economic discussions at the summit in a moment, but just on this point of the EU's role. And as I say, Antonio Costa said, we need to now focus on effective diplomacy. And he said, and I'm quoting, here Europe has a role to play. Janis questioning whether Europe really does have a role, whether anyone really would listen to Europe. What is your sense of what the EU should do, if anything?
Just coming back to the point Janis already discussed, I think we are united only in our common impotence. We are unable to move the dial on these issues because none of the parties there care about what Europeans think. We are not consistent and coherent anyway. So it would be very difficult to say what that position is, even if we were more effective in getting it across. Yes, of course, the European Union will be part of the diplomatic effort, and we've seen that also already with the E3 talking to the Iranian foreign minister. But is it going to change anything about what is happening there? I think the last month have shown that we have absolutely no influence on what is going on.
Okay. Let us turn to the economic agenda and that interlinkage that Janis talked about earlier, and indeed an interlinkage that Antonio Costa made very clearly when he was inviting EU leaders to the summit. In his traditional letter, he talked about the interplay between a challenging international context and our internal economic priorities is more important than ever. First, on the issue of the trade talks with the US, we've already alluded to how that might have impacted on the discussions on NATO and on defense spending. But there does seem, Fabian, to be some disagreement between EU leaders about the approach that we should take now. Is this an area, and I've heard suggestions, and maybe you can enlighten me more, that Chancellor Merz very much on the side of let's do a quick deal. It may not be a very good deal, but let's do it. We need to do it for the sake of vital industries, versus those who say, being tough, being more confrontational is the only language Donald Trump understands, and we need to play a longer game and toughen this out. What is your sense of where that conversation is? We have less than 2 weeks to go till the July 9th deadline that was set by Trump for a deal. Your sense of what the likely outcome will be and what it should be?
There certainly are different voices now about how best to deal with this level of challenge. They come in part from a different reading of why Trump is doing this, what he wants to achieve, what the final outcome is. If you take a traditional economic logic, and I know this is difficult to do because Trump is to all intents and purposes economically illiterate, but what we are seeing is that yes, if you want to have a transactional deal, you would give Trump some things he wants, and then hopefully he will not continue to attack the European Union. Personally, I think that is a misreading of Trump. I don't think this is what it is about in the end. It's not just about a deal. It is in part about victory, so this can help in the short run because he can declare victory. But in the long run, it doesn't because ultimately the underlying issues which are there for Trump are not going to go away.
So what should the EU be doing?
I think what we have to continue to do is unfortunately react. And this is in part what we are doing at this moment in time. Essentially, we are waiting. We're waiting for the date to elapse to see what Trump might be willing to accept on that day. It might change according to what he had for breakfast. So there is a reasonable chance that he might agree to something, he might not. But I think what really should be the focus of European policy thinking is that we think much more strategically about this. What is the long term we are aiming for? How do we deal with these kind of challenges on an ongoing basis? What does this mean being in a world where global rules are being constantly undermined? These are in many ways areas where we can only prepare because at this moment in time, we will be under this constant fire from the White House, but prepare we should.
Janis, just please do briefly react on that if you will, but I wanted to also bring up a proposal from Ursula von der Leyen, from the Commission President, about what she called more structured cooperation, a joining of forces, if you like, with the Asian Pacific trade bloc, those 12 countries in the Common and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's snappily titled CPTPP. I love these acronyms. But this idea that given now the entire dysfunctionality of the World Trade Organization, that it is frankly in all but name defunct because, and to a large degree because the US has blocked key decisions, that maybe it's time to look at setting something up that could either discuss a redesign of the WTO or be an alternative body. What has been the reaction from member states to that? And do you think it's a runner?
Let me start by adding something to the trade negotiations, because I think if you witness the past weeks, maybe even 2 months, you see that what we hear from the US, also because of problems which the Trump administration is facing when it comes to international political and geopolitical relations, has been more accommodating. If you carefully listen to also people like J.D. Vance, so it's not only Trump. If you listen to the state secretary, you can hear them being more accommodating vis-a-vis the EU and Europe. So I would guess that chances are high that a settlement can be reached. But then Fabian is also right, because you don't know what will happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And on the day itself, Trump might change his mind. And even when it comes to difficult decisions when it comes to Iran, it seems that he took the decision only 10 minutes before he gave the order. So when it comes to the trade negotiations, I think that there is a chance that a solution can be found. And the fact that you have different perspectives on member states is also something which might be helping in this, because you can indicate there are some who want to get a quick deal and others who are really very worried about having a deal. So you can also, as a commission, indicate, I also need to make sure that I keep the 27 together, because I'm not sure that they will play ball. And let's not forget that, yes, I'm negotiating, but I have to have the 27 behind me. And also the indication that, maybe we should be fine if we can get a deal along the lines of the US-UK deal, by the way, where we do not know the details of that deal. I think it seems to be indicating, I think that we're moving in a direction where potentially some form of settlement can be found. Now, with respect to WTO,
alternative to the WTO?
Well, first of all, this is not a new idea. And by the way, it had also been discussed, and the German Chancellor also mentioned this very explicitly in his press conference, between, in this case, the UK, France, and Germany, the leaders of the three countries discussing this idea. So finding some form of own dispute settlement body, given that the WTO doesn't work. Now you have this being discussed also at the European Council. So it is something which I think is being tested, is being seen as to how far we can get. And I think we're still in this test phase of seeing, how is this potentially attractive? The fact that it's being taken up, also that the German Chancellor took it up so prominently in the press conference. And let's not forget, it was his first European Council. And so he was rather trying to be, on the back of the scene, not producing himself so strongly. But on this point, he really picked it up, he pushed it. Also, indicating that it came from Ursula von der Leyen, and we know that they didn't always have the best of relations between each other. So I think there is a debate which potentially could lead to somewhere, but actually it's not only in the hands of Europeans. Huh?
Fabian, do add to that if you want to, but we don't have that long, and I want to talk about two other issues in relation, or three actually, but firstly on the competitiveness agenda, and whether this summit moved us forward anymore in broad terms, and also perhaps you could say 2 words about the language on an international, strengthening the international role of the euro. What are they really looking at here? And how feasible is it? How ambitious are they being, and how ambitious can they be when it comes to the international role of the euro?
So on competitiveness, I could, in the interest of time, be very quick. No, we haven't moved forward. There hasn't really been anything new on the table. I think what we are already witnessing is that the grand plans of Draghi are disappearing off the radar. We're not really talking about that anymore. It has now become part of the day-to-day running of, well, we have compasses and roadmaps and strategies.
And omnibuses.
And omnibuses and many different things. So we are developing our competitive advantage in producing paper, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be much more than that.
It does all seem to have boiled down to the simplification debate and not much else, even when you look at the language of the council.
And it has not boiled down to ultimately to say, what is it we are going to concretely deliver, which in particular companies see in their day-to-day lives as being an incentive to continue to invest in Europe, because that's what we need. And I don't see we're moving in that direction at all. On the role of the euro, similar to Janis's answer, this is one of those topics which keeps coming up over the years. Every time we have a particular international problem, in this case, with the strength of the dollar as a reserve currency, we then talk about how we could turn the euro into something which could, at least in part, fulfill some of those functions. But we lack the courage to do that in any case, so I don't believe that we will do it at this moment in time when we are in this confrontation with the Trumpian White House in any case. Maybe he won't notice, but I still don't think that we have the courage to actually do anything substantive on these issues.
Very brief, Janis, if you would.
Just with respect to the role of the euro, and what the European Council conclusion says is that it invites institutions to reinforce the euro's international role. And I think what here the sign is, don't hamper the fact that the US Treasury market is under pressure. There's money which is not being invested in the US Treasury market, which undermines, which has to do with the lack of trust in the US economy, also in Trump himself, in the Trump administration, and that what they're doing we will have to pay for it. So that is in itself strengthening the role of the euro. And you don't need to do much actively yourself, because it is other reasons, structural reasons, at least at the moment, which is pushing people and investors to invest more into the euro than they are in the US dollar. But I think, just 1 second, when it comes to competitiveness, yes, we're going for the low-hanging fruits. And the low-hanging fruits, we think, is especially deregulation, cutting red tape. But when it comes to what Draghi was asking for, we're far away from the mindset we would need in order to implement what he's been asking for. And if he would be with us, he would explain to us in detail of why actually what we're seeing happening is not along the line of what he had been proposing, if you look into the deep-rooted things that have to be done.
Great to get him back and hear his views on where we are now. But linked to this issue, and a last point before I try to look ahead to the autumn, Fabian, on the competitiveness debate, the issue of the climate. targets, because this apparently appears to have been the longest discussion and the most heated discussion at this summit. And this was about the targets for 2035 and 2040, but we also saw in the run-up to the summit a row over what appeared to be the Commission dropping a proposal for some anti-greenwashing legislation, then some confusion over whether they had dropped it or they hadn't dropped it, European Parliament reacting furiously to that. When you look at that and you look at the calls from some member states for much more flexibility in terms of the targets for 2035 and 2040, I mean, the Commission has tried to say until now, the Green Deal is still alive and well. All we are doing, there is no contradiction with the competitiveness agenda, but we have done what with the big things we need to do on the Green Deal. That's why we're focusing on competitiveness. Your reading of this conversation about the targets, this row about the anti-greenwashing legislation, do you think that are we effectively saying that the leitmotif of Ursula von der Leyen VDL1 Commission, the Green Deal, is really no longer with us in VDL2, or is that an overstatement of where we are? Are they just trying to play the politics more carefully? Fabian first.
In a way, the Green Deal will never go away because we have put it into European law. And as we know, European law is glacially slow to change. So it is very unlikely that we will see a substantive revisiting of the Green Deal. However, what we've also said in previous updates is that climate policy, and in particular the cost of climate policy and the distributional impact of climate policy, is going to be one of the big political issues which particularly the populists are going to focus on. Here they are not talking about not believing in climate change, man-made climate change, or at least most of them don't, but they talk about the unfairness of how the provisions are going to affect certain parts of the populations, also on a national basis. And I think this is part of that debate we're going to continue to have whenever we reach a point where we have to do something like, for example, defining targets for the future. But I think the underlying theme, and I thought that was an interesting aspect of this debate, is really about implementation. It's not about what we have agreed at the European level, is in how far member states will seriously put this into practice, and in how far the Commission is going to push them, monitor them, and if necessary, take action against them. And there I would be very skeptical, because I think where we are now is in very much a softening of the implementation of the Green Deal.
Just a very quick one I wanted to squeeze in from Philippe Hammer-Drups in our audience, and it links to the conversation we're having now, because the deepening of the single market, one of the issues that Antonio Costa wants people to talk about. We were talking earlier about enlargement and that sense that it is moving in the wrong direction. But Philippe Hammer-Drups says, what consequences would an enlargement in these circumstances have upon the single market? Would it be credible anymore? I mean, Fabian, how do you see the connection between those two conversations, if you do? And then I'm going to put you both on the spot, starting with Janis.
I think if we look at enlargement, and we won't have the time to go into that detail, but in many ways, these are exceptional cases. So we would have to think very carefully in all policy areas whether the standard status quo is what we should apply in this particular case. Just to say, for example, when we look at Ukraine and agriculture, it's very hard for me to see that it makes sense to apply the common agricultural policy as it is to Ukraine. So I think this is a debate we have to have also when it comes to the single market. But I would turn the question a little bit on its head. Are we going to do anything meaningful in terms of deepening the single market anyway? Because I'm not seeing that we are actually moving in that direction. And even in those areas, and just to put that marker down again, not that I have great hope, but for example, the Capital Markets Union, or whatever we want to call it now. Where has that gone? Are we actually having that on the table? And what I'm lacking in all of this is both the sense of urgency to say we are doing it now, not in a few years' time, not talking about it, and the sense of concreteness to say this is what we are actually putting on the table. Not the nice words, but actually here is what we are going to do.
Which leads me beautifully into my final question, because the State of the Union speech, which Ursula von der Leyen will give in September, is, of course, always full of very nice words. But I want to put you both on the spot. In the context we are talking about and these multiple challenges, myriad challenges, and you appealed there for urgency and concreteness. Janis, what do you expect the Commission President to focus on in her State of the Union speech in September? And if you were writing her speech, and this is what I meant by putting you on the spot, what would you focus on and what would your overarching message be? So I'm giving you the job of being her speechwriter. What would you hope people will be able to take away from that speech? Same question to both of you. Janis first.
First of all, I'm not good enough to be a speechwriter, but I think what I expect is that it will be, and we've seen that also in her inaugural speech of von der Leyen II Commission, but also in previous State of the Union speeches. So if you look into that, I think what you can expect is that there will be a long list of appraisal of successes, of what has been accomplished, of where things have been progressing, where we have made big leaps forward. I think you will see a long list of that. I hope, I expect, but I also hope that there will be also highlighting, that you will be highlighting that what we have done is not enough, is not quick enough. But I think, and that's where my wishful thinking comes, is that there will be clarity with respect to what are the deficits, what are the shortcomings we're still having in terms of implementing the priorities which we have set. Towards the European Council before this meeting, she sent a letter with respect to migration, 5 or 6 pages, a long letter, where she was not only describing of what has been done, but she was also describing what the shortcomings are, what still needs to be done. And I hope that she will also do that in this in the State of the Union address, but that she will be even bolder in the sense of what she thinks needs to be done. And she needs to be selectively argue of what are the things where member states are lagging behind. She is convinced that things will have to happen, even though she will know that some, or even many member states and even key member states are opposing her view, that she will dare to put the finger there where things need to happen. Will she do that? I have big question marks.
Fabian.
I fear if I wrote that speech, I probably would be fired.
It will never be delivered, yes.
So I'm not going to say what I would put in the speech. I would say what I think should be there, because I think firstly, and that connects also to what Janis was saying, is the brutal truth. And that also means saying we are actually falling behind where we should be and not moving ahead. And then I would say, rather than having these grand, wide-ranging speeches where we touch on all of the different issues, I would love to see just maybe 5 points, very concrete, to say, these are the 5 things we are going to put on the table. Of course, we don't know whether the member states are going to agree to it, but this is what's going to be on the table. For example, including a mechanism to get real serious money to Ukraine. That's the kind of thing, the Capital Markets Union, procurement on military goods, but very, very concrete. Here is something we're going to put on the table, and then we're going to see whether the member states take it or not. That should also include enlargement and reform, as we've talked about today, and it has to include financing. And I hope very much that we are not going to spend the next 3 years fighting about 0.1% of GDP, whether we're shifting that from one bit of the MFF to the other, but that we're talking about real money for real priorities.
Thank you very much. And we will be back. We're going to take a break for the summer, but we will be back on the day of that speech with an instant analysis of the speech, what she said, what she really meant, and what the analysis, Fabian and Janis's analysis of what she should have said and what was missing from that. So we do hope you will join us again for that. Just to draw your attention to a couple of publications in the last couple of days, EPC publications, the Israel-Iran 12-day war compendium, which brings together insights from EPC analysts on the fallout from the Iran-Israel war and all those significant changes in the Middle East we've been discussing, and also an annotated version of the Hague NATO Summit Declaration, examining what the leaders actually said, what they didn't say, and what they might have meant. So do take a look at those if you have time. Only remains me to thank Fabian and Janis, as always, for a great discussion. Thank all of you for joining us, and we will see you back after that speech in September. In the meantime, from me, have a wonderful summer. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.